Let us pray, and pray we must. We citizens who cherish this one nation under God, a duty flowing from our bold confession, in God we trust. So we readily praise a Creator who has bestowed upon and ingrained into the very nature of his creatures certain inalienable rights, acknowledged by the founders, enshrined in our country's normative documents, defended with the blood of grateful patriots. You, dear Lord, have bestowed these inalienable rights, not kings, tyrants, or any government, rights flowing from the innate human dignity of the person and the sacredness of all human life. You have made self-evident in reason and nature, celebrated in your own revelation. While we will never give up, beseeching you, dear God, to mend our every flaw, we renew our gratitude for this homeland founded on these inalienable rights, asking your blessing upon this noble project initiated by Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Glendon, and your guidance as we renew our sense of duty to share our country's wisdom on rights inherent to the very nature of the human person, never, ever to be trampled. To the sovereign of the nations, creator of all, bestower of rights, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen.
Many of you are like me. I've always felt that I've met my responsibilities as an American citizen rather well. And yet, honest contemplation of the past and the present forces me to confess that there may have been some things that I've overlooked, as perhaps have you. It must be quite apparent by this time to any thinking individual that the people of our country and people of other countries all over the world are coming to face a moment of grave decision, a time when we will choose the course of our future. The choice lies between two opposing ideologies. On the one side, socialist communism, vesting total power over the individual within the state. On the other side, democratic capitalism, advocating a people's government and granting to the individual certain rights and freedoms: freedom of thought, of speech, freedom of worship, the right of free enterprise, free assembly, and many other rights and freedoms. Now, it would seem inconceivable to me that any thinking person would voluntarily choose socialist communism, inasmuch as in so doing he divests himself of all individual rights and subjects himself completely to the dictates and the will of whatever individuals may be in control of the state from time to time. To me, that's like signing a blank check and handing it to a stranger, without any right of cancellation should it fall into the wrong hands. And yet, in just a few short years, the proponents of socialist communism have succeeded in bringing under their influence or control nearly 40% of the world's people. How has this been accomplished? It's with the fervent hope that together we might find an answer to that question that I ask you to remain with us here for a little while, to look, to listen, and to think.
The whole world is sick. Not just one part of the world. When a human organism is sick, one cannot amputate an arm or a leg and feel that one has completely eradicated a poison, particularly when it is through the system. So it is with the world. We cannot... My angel's getting rambunctious tonight, I see that. It is impossible for us just simply to point our finger to one particular country and say that it is wrong. Our great problem, of course, is communism. What is the role of communism? That will be our subject tonight, or perhaps half of it. The role of communism in the world, and also in relation to it, the role of America. The role of communism we will discuss, first of all, before the conversion of Russia, because communism will never be defeated. Communism will be converted. If the world is ever to have peace, be converted to God. And then we will talk of the role of communism after conversion. First of all, the role of communism before conversion. The role of communism now, in other words, what is it? The best answer to that question is given in the words of our divine Lord. He said, "Where the body is, there shall the eagles be gathered together. Wherever the carcass is, there shall come the vultures." Very often in the desert, an animal or a human dies. The moment of its death, one can see nothing in the clear skies. And then suddenly, from out mountain fastnesses and rocky crags, these vultures of the skies come down to this glittering rottenness in order to devour it. These winged creatures are a kind of an avenger and a punisher. They are a judgment upon death and corruption. And just as soon as corruption sets in, these winged monsters appear, shrieking and croaking and winging their way to death itself. And that indeed is a symbol of civilizations, for they die too, just as well as animal and human life. And whenever a civilization begins to die morally or spiritually, then there begin to appear vultures. And that is the mission of communism in the world. Communism is the scavenger of decaying civilizations. It makes its way into a country and into a culture only when that culture begins to rot from the inside. Measure of the incipient death in any civilization is the progress that communism makes. And just as soon as this culture begins to die, then this winged scavenger, with the mechanical wings of hammer and sickles, descend upon these decaying countries in order to devour them. Toynbee says in his history that 16 out of 19 civilizations that have decayed from the beginning of the world until the present time have decayed from within. Lincoln always said that America would never be conquered from without. If it ever perished, and please God it will not, it would come only from within. The proper way then to look upon communism is to see in it a judgment of God. Communism is something that came out of our Western civilization anyway. It came out of what was putrid and foul and dead in our thinking. There was not a single philosophical idea in communism that did not come from the West. Its philosophy came from Germany, its sociology from France, its economics from England. And what Russia gave it was an Asiatic soul and power and force. Communism then is coming back upon the Western world because something died in the Western world. Namely, the strong faith of men in the God that made them. And before Russia is won back again to the faith, therefore, regard communism as a kind of a manure, a fertilizer. It is a death that is spread upon the civilizations of the world until the springtime of a newer and better world begins to come into being. This is the role of communism from a divine point of view, before conversion, and then afterwards, what will it be? When Russia receives the gift of faith, Russia will have a new role. And its role then will be to be an apostle to the rest of the world. It will help bring faith to the rest of the world. Why are we so hopeful about Russia? Why should it be the means of evangelizing nations of the earth? For one reason. Russia has fire. It has zeal. Communism has that. The great shame of the world is that we have the truth, but we have no zeal. They have zeal, but they have no truth. Communism is like a fire that's spreading itself over the world, and this fire is already in their hearts. Someday, instead of burning downward, that fire will begin to burn upward in a Pentecostal fashion, and that it will bring light and peace and joy to men, as today it's bringing hate and tyranny and destruction and death. Our Western world lacks that fire. We lack it, obviously. Where is the fire of patriotism today? Our great country does not know whose cross it is carrying. Actually, we are carrying a nobler cross than we know. We are bearing a nobler cross than we deserve. We have already saved the world from the swastika that would cross out the cross and make a double cross. Now we must save the world from the hammer and the sickle, the hammer that would re-crucify men, and the sickle that would cut immature wheat in order that it would never be the bread of life. And America's role is to change these symbols so that one day men will carry hammers erect, and these hammers will look like crosses as they parade in the name of God. And the sickle will look like the moon under the lady's feet, to whom these broadcasts were dedicated, to bring you to God and to make Americans love one another unto the betterment of the world and the peace of human souls.
We're going to examine in quite a bit of detail the communist theory and practice of revolution, particularly as applied to the United States. Now, this will not be something dreamed up out of thin air. This will be the strategy as taught by them and advocated by them in their own manuals, in their textbooks, and in their schools. Now, the organization of this material will lead to three rather startling conclusions. The first is that the communist program for revolution in America is divided into two phases, violent and nonviolent. The second conclusion is that the strategy for violent revolution calls for chaos, anarchy, mass confusion and panic among the people, a crisis in government, and then, out of the vacuum, the sudden seizure of power by communist-led guerrilla bands. The third conclusion is that the nonviolent phase of revolution actually is more important to the communists and more potentially dangerous to us. Now, the strategy for this phase calls for the gradual transition of our government into a communist regime, done peacefully and legally, but under the banner of socialism. Now, a good place to begin is with this communist booklet entitled On the Nature of Revolution, the Marxist theory of social change. It was written by Herbert Aptheker, one of the leading theoreticians of the Communist Party in this country. And on page 11, Aptheker says, "The equating of violence with the nature and process of revolution is not correct. Violence may or may not appear in such a process, and its presence or absence is not a determining feature of the definition." Now, this comes as quite a surprise to many of us because for years we've been used to thinking of communist revolutions only as those which involve the overthrow of governments by force and violence. Now, that entire phrase has been written and spoken so often as a single concept that many of us haven't even considered the possibility that the communists might have another approach to their goal, that they might overthrow the government without force and violence, that they might, in fact, plan to come to power through means that properly could be called peace and politics. For instance, when the communists speak of violent revolution, they describe it as a war of national liberation. Now, the so-called theory behind this is that the people of the country marked for takeover supposedly are an oppressed people. They're dominated by an imperialistic foreign power that has colonized them and exploited them. And so the communists claim that it's their duty, their historic duty, to liberate them from the yoke of fascism or imperialism or colonialism or whatever. Now, naturally, the communist orientation of the movement is played down. They prefer to identify themselves usually as a People's Army of Liberation or a National Liberation Front. Of course, this is the kind of guerrilla warfare we've seen used in China, Algeria, Cuba, South Vietnam, and many other places around the world. But there are other phrases also used to describe the same process. Occasionally, they'll refer to this violent type of revolution as an anti-imperialist war or an anti-colonialist war, but they all equal the same thing. Wars of national liberation, anti-imperialist wars, and anti-colonialist wars are all phrases used to describe that aspect of communist revolution aimed at overthrowing the government by means of force and violence. To describe their nonviolent revolution, the communists most often use the term proletarian revolution, but they also refer to it as the socialist revolution and sometimes as the anti-monopoly struggle. But here again, they all add up to the same thing. The proletarian revolution, the socialist revolution, and the anti-monopoly struggle are all merely different ways in which the communists describe their strategy for overthrowing the government.
Good morning, Revolution, and welcome everybody to this week. It's been one hell of a week, and we're going to be talking about it and also things going forward this morning. Welcome, Anita. Good morning. How are you?
Thank you, Joe. Just fine. Thank you for having me.
Anita Waters from the great Buckeye, from the great state of Ohio. I don't know if you're an original Buckeye, but if not,
it's my adopted homeland.
You're an adopted.
Yeah.
That's
I'm a New Yorker. I'm a New Yorker.
Oh, okay.
Originally,
okay.
right.
Well, I'm a transplanted New Yorker, and another transplanted New Yorker. So he's actually from Joe Biden, who is his home boy, his home state. Scott Hiley is with us on the phone this morning. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, Anita. Good morning, Revolution.
All right.
And my adopted home is Chicago. So.
Oh, adopted in Chicago, but by way of Pennsylvania, now New York State.
Yep.
Well, we are internationalists, you know, we're interstatists. we are the world, you know, as they used to say. You know, we're one growing international community, but we still live in a nation state, and we still have a, you know, working class and people who are trying to move towards more power, state power, and eventually a socialist society. That's what we're fighting for. But we're in the middle of an upsurge now, right? And it's what's going on in Ohio, the big demonstrations in Columbus, Anita, how's that going?
Absolutely. There has been something pretty much from that Thursday night onward, pretty much every day, there's been something going on. And we've had protests all over Ohio. Even the small towns like Newark nearby had 150 people on their square, and Athens had a big demonstration, of course. But Columbus has had huge demonstrations and very violent situations with the police. The police really behaving very badly and behaving badly on a videotape as well. For instance, on Saturday, the police really without warning, sent tear gas and pepper spray into the crowd. And the crowd included my Congresswoman, Joyce Beatty, and a number of elected officials from the city council were in the crowd that got pepper sprayed with no warning. So they got to see it firsthand. And the Ohio State University newspaper reporters, the Lantern is their newspaper, and that's they've done a great job covering the protests at OSU in particular. And they have some dramatic video of media representatives from the Lantern being tear gassed by police without really. They said they have their media credentials out. They had Lantern clothing on, but the police just rushed them through and then tear gassed them when
they just didn't care. They just didn't care, you know.
No, exactly.
That's their custom, right? I mean,
they were angry. And the police are angry and defensive and just acting out.
Well, and it's also a picture of capitalism more generally, which is, you know, it is fundamentally unequal, and it requires the use of violence to maintain order. I mean, there are different levels of violence and different ways of deploying it, and we're seeing, you know, a more and more extreme form now, perhaps. And I should say that, you know, people of color have been facing violence of that sort for decades and centuries. But for many people, you know, it's an uptick. It's a kind of new unveiling of how violent the state is willing to be, but it's rooted in the way capitalism works.
Well, there's violence, and then there's violence, and there are also other forms. In fact, the main forms of consent are not explicitly violent in this society. They use cultural forms, they use alcohol, they use drugs, they use all kinds of different trappings to make it appear that you're okay. But you're right, in this situation, Black folk and Latinos have been living under occupation, you know, that's one of the, I met with our club in Minneapolis last night, by the way. We do have a club there, and they are very involved in the struggle. From the beginning, they were at all of the demonstrations, and they not only demonstrated, but they cleaned up after the demonstrations, you know. They were involved in the situation of when the right wing came in, you know, and committed the acts of arson, and they set up, not just our comrades, but the people in these communities set up neighborhood patrols to push the vigilantes out, you know. That's a story that I hadn't heard told, and a very important one. But here's the thing. There's been a police riot going on. Police have been rioting, you know, and this has raised the level of attention and the outrage in broad sections of society, because a lot of people are getting pepper sprayed and gassed and beat up and hit with clubs and so on and so forth. And the demands are growing. Abolish the police, defund the police, community control of the police. You know, and some people say, oh, no, you can't do that. In Minneapolis, they've called for dismantling the police department. I saw in Newark, the mayor of Newark, Mayor Baraka, has put forward proposals to outlaw terrorism in the police department, outlaw racist and fascist gangs in the Newark Police Department, require the police to live in the city of New York. So, I mean, Newark, not New York, excuse me, got a little excited there. Newark is a separate state, separate city. Not a suburb of New York. Y'all from Newark, don't get mad at me now. So, where do we stand on these issues? Because there's a lot of some people are saying you have to be an abolitionist, which, you know, I kind of am, broadly speaking. I want to abolish capitalism, you know. I want to abolish slavery. I stand with John Brown and Fred Douglass and all of that. I want to abolish sexism. But with respect to the prisons, they say, oh, if you're not an abolitionist, then you're some kind of reformist, you know. And Anita, what's our position on this issue? Let me ask more specifically, how are these demands playing out in Columbus?
Well, I think our position is that we recognize that these institutions, like the police, are really the descendant institutions from anti-Black, you know, enforcers of slavery. So I think we have to we have to demand some really thoroughgoing, not even reformation, transformation of ways that societies need to keep order. I mean, every society has needs of keeping order in its society and making people feel safe. And I think there are ways to do that that don't have anything to do with police and especially armed police and the kind of things that they do. So I think in Columbus, we're continuing to make demands. There's an effort in the legislature to declare racism a public health emergency, which is a really interesting approach. And then, as far as the police are concerned, there are the police union contract expires this year, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the mayor to make significant changes in that. There's a call for resignation of our mayor and the chief of police, who's not a very, he's very much an apologist for police brutality, Thomas Quinlan. And I looked at that this morning, and about 25,000 signatures have been generated for that demand. So and Ohio State University faculty are demanding that the university cut ties with the police. So there's a lot of demands on from different angles. And I think the People's World
could use some writing on that kind of a subject. That's a really interesting development. But what about you, Scott? Are you an abolitionist or are you a reformist in favor of community policing? I mean, I want to know where do you stand, and where do you think the Communist Party should stand?
I am a communist, big C and small c, right? I believe that we need we are working for a society that is where the state in its repressive form no longer exists, where there's no need for police or for jails. In the immediate struggle, the demand that makes the most sense to me is for community control of the police, real community control, meaning that you have an elected board composed of members from every precinct in, whatever city you're dealing with, and that board decides on hiring policies, training policies, use of force policies, discipline. Communities know what their needs are, right? And we need to have structures. Like these people claim they wear badges and they claim to carry guns and use force in the name of the people. So put them under the control of the people. As far as abolition goes, the abolishing the police in a certain sense is like abolishing the capitalist class. It doesn't mean, killing them all, as some people seem to think on the right. We get accused of that. How do you say you're peaceful, but you want to abolish the capitalist class? No, you abolish capitalism. You abolish capitalists by taking away their property. Then they're just people. You abolish police by taking away all the trappings of the racist, violent police culture that is developed under U.S. capitalism.
You know, part of the problem is these guns and weapons. People don't want to deal with that, but it's true. You know, because the police claim, well, when we go into these communities, we're getting under fire by heavy artillery. And it's true. You know, I know back where I come from, people are, you know, are armed to the teeth, you know, and you just go to the Youngstown Vindicator and type in AK-47, and you'll see pages upon pages of stories about police capturing, you know, automatic weapons and shoulder to air missile launchers, all kinds of things. But this is because of the prevalence of the gun lobby, you know, and the drug trafficking and all of that. And so all of these issues are interconnected. And in order to solve one, you have to solve the other. But coming back to the issue of, you know, abolishing the police, who in their right mind can be opposed to getting rid of the armed occupation of our communities. I like the way Angela Davis handled it at the Alliance Refounding Conference last fall. She said, of course, we're in favor of that, but that doesn't mean that we're opposed to medium range and short-term measures that will move us down the road. You know, I wrote a letter, I wrote in a note to a friend this morning, being opposed to abolishing is like being opposed to getting rid of pollution-free air. You know, we're in favor of clean air. The question is, how do we get from a polluted state to a clean, you know, lead-free, pollution-free, ozone-enhanced atmosphere? And there are intermediate steps that can be taken. And the most important one, I think, Scott, is, you know, as you said, community control. If you got elected boards, you can hire, you can fire, you can defund, you can address the budget issues in a way, and the working class and people are empowered. Your neighbors are empowered. Your coworkers are empowered to do that, and that's the most important thing. But the bigger issue, let me just say this, Scott, is the state. And this week, or last week, I forget when it was, Trump tried to involve the military in domestic affairs. And the head of the Joint Chiefs apologized for it this week. Scott, there's a split in the ruling class. What's going on?
I normally downplay. I have a tendency to downplay that sort of, you know, opposition to Trump within the ruling class, or within, especially in the right of the ruling class. But this is real. When you have military, active, high-ranking military officers publicly breaking with the president and publicly signaling initiatives that they know he will oppose, like removing changing the names of bases named for Confederate traitors, that is significant. It means that Trump's position and that of the whole cluster clique around him is very unsteady, and it's unsteady not because the ruling class is coming to its senses or whatever, but because the uprising of the people in multiple forms, elections, in the streets, the strike wave is forcing them to reckon with new political realities. We also shouldn't underestimate the fact that NASCAR outlawed the Confederate flag, or that the Southern Baptist Convention decided to retire the gavel that belonged to a slaveholder that it used at all of its conventions. These are signs of something very big underway.
Well, Anita, are these symbolic things really important? I mean, NASCAR getting rid of the Dixie flag, and are those like measures that are meant to appease the more substantial changes, in your opinion?
Well, I do think they're important. I think they send a message of solidarity. There are symbolic things, and then there are structural things. We're always talking about structural racism, and we don't see those structures so easily. They're embedded in laws or in decisions that city planners make about where to put a highway, for example. So those structural effects, it's harder to see them, but the symbolic measures that have been taken, I think, are really strong. And it really does seem to have put a wedge into the electorate, I think, or the working class about where Trump and that ilk are standing on that issue. So I think those are signs of weakening, a shrinking of that base of people who are willing to put up with that kind of overt racism. Yeah, he seems to be doubling down into a more and more of a white supremacist party, bringing the GOP into that. And I think people are getting a little bit nervous about that right now, even in their own party.
A little nervous, yeah. They need to be a lot nervous because he ain't nothing but a Scott likes to call them neo-Confederates. And that's one way to describe them. You know, good old boy, good old time racist is another apt a phrase. Well, Scott, it looks like your homeboy Biden is leading in the Democratic contest, at least according to the polls, by 10, 12 points. Do you think he's going to carry it all the way to the finish line?
In terms of defeating Trump?
Yeah. What else are we talking about?
I thought you were still talking about like the primaries for some reason. Which is
last time I looked, they were over.
Yeah, he's got the delegates he needs. I mean, the question for me is not, can Biden defeat Trump? Because I don't think of it in those terms.
You're not endorsing Biden, is that what you're saying?
I am endorsing and praising and expressing my joy and solidarity with the incredible and very broad uprising that is happening, and it is not Biden and Trump. It is an invigorated and militant, democratic, anti-racist, sometimes anti-monopoly and anti-capitalist movement that is taking on an ultra-reactionary, fascist-leaning, or fascist threat, and that's the contest I see. Biden defeating Trump in November is part of that. Winning legislative majorities is part of it. But unless those electoral victories translate into structural changes to the way policing is done, to the way voting is conducted, things like that, unless we can actually break the power of the extreme right, the legislative victories are kind of secondary, and we need the uprising to continue on all fronts.
And we need to march, Anita, from the streets to the a ballot box. But people have got to be motivated, right, to march to the a ballot box, and there have to be planks and platforms that address our needs. And by the way, Anita, on the issue of policing and abolition and community control and defunding, one of the things we need to say, right, is that the African American people's movement, Black Lives Matter, they're independent movements. They're independent movements. We got to respect their demands. We don't get to decide for them what they should think or say. They are experiencing the brunt of this iron fist of oppression coming from the state, and that has to be weighed into the calculation, don't you think?
Absolutely. That Black Lives Matter agenda, I think, is really giving leadership to some of our organizations. Our young people, for example, expressed that to me just last night. The people who are involved in the national youth movement in our party, that the Black Lives Matter agenda really is setting the tone. And it also, I mean, as far as going to the ballot box, I think that all of this activity and the fact that it's about police and about local as well as national structures, I think that is opening up the possibility for people to get even more enthusiastic about voting for levels like prosecutor or city council members and mayors and sheriffs. In some places they're elected, like in Ohio. So I think those demands will our activity will eventually motivate people to take part in all of those elections on every level. So
I think, Anita, you got the last word. We're going to have to bring it to a close there. I agree with you very much. So rather than repeat it, I'm just going to stop. And thank you very much for showing up, Scott. Have a great week. Check out cpusa.org. We got some great articles there, and keep the pressure on, right, Anita?
Right. Keep the pressure on. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Scott. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, have a good weekend, comrades. Bye.
Well, all right, having defined some of the key phrases, we can return now to the communist literature and be able to understand what they mean when they use these words. Now, in 1960, the representatives from communist parties all over the world gathered in Moscow and issued a joint declaration which included this statement: "Our time, whose main content is the transition of capitalism to socialism, is a time of socialist revolutions and national liberation revolutions." In other words, simply stated, we're living in an era of two kinds of revolution, one violent and the other nonviolent. Now, here's a document published by the Communist Party in this country in 1968. It's entitled "The New Program of the Communist Party USA, a Second Draft." And on this subject, here's what it says. Contemporary revolutions bear two distinctive marks. They are socialist, they are anti-imperialist. More than 1 billion human beings are now embarked on socialist revolution. A larger number is in varying stages of revolution for national liberation. Well, in order to relate this general concept of two kinds of revolution to the specific application here in the United States, it'll be necessary for us to examine rather closely the communist position on what they describe as the Negro question. Now, basically summarized, the communist position on the Negro question is as follows. As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart and that Americans could be divided, weakened, and perhaps even set against each other in open combat. They said in no unmistakable terms that the Negro people, because of their secondary social status and their predominant working class composition, offered greater revolutionary possibilities than any other cross-section of the population. To develop these possibilities, the communists proclaimed that the American Negro constituted a separate nation within a nation, a colony within the continental borders of the United States. The people of this nation were said to be oppressed and exploited by colonialist, imperialist, racist America. Consequently, the Communist Party called for their liberation, their right to self-determination, to break away from the United States and to set up their own nation within our borders. Now, to bring this about, of course, force and violence must be used. A war of national liberation must be fought. The territory designated for this nation to be liberated was the Black Belt in the South, those counties and states in which the Negro population was dominant. When established, The new nation was to have a Soviet-type government and be totally subservient to the Communist Party. But, and this is extremely important, the Communists made it clear from the very beginning that they could never hope to capture all of the United States with a war of national liberation, only part of it. You see, elsewhere in the world, the segment of the population supposedly liberated by the Communists has been a majority segment. The peasants in China, the Muslims in Algeria, all the people in Cuba. But in the United States, our Negro population is in the minority. And even if the Communists should be successful in creating similar liberation movements among other segments of our people, as they're trying to do, for instance, among Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and even American Indians, even if they should succeed and then amalgamate all of these together into one large liberation movement, it still adds up to a minority of the total population. And the Communists are not stupid. They realize that revolution of force and violence dependent upon a minority is doomed to ultimate failure, except in those areas where they actually do constitute a majority. But they aren't going to settle for just part of the United States. They want all of it. And so they made it clear long ago that their violent war of national liberation must be secondary to the nonviolent proletarian revolution. To take the United States, all of the United States, it'll be necessary, they say, to involve white people as well as black, to create a broad coalition, a revolutionary link between the civil rights movement, organized labor, peace groups, student dissidents, and in general, to escalate the revolution in America from race war to class war. Now this, in a nutshell, is the Communist position on the Negro question. Let's turn now to the record and see how the Communists themselves explain it. Now, this Communist booklet, entitled American Negro Problems, was published in 1928. It was written by John Pepper, alias Joseph Pogany. Now, Pogany was sent to this country as the personal envoy of Joseph Stalin, and his specific mission was to bring the American Communist Party into line with the policies and directives from Moscow, particularly with regard to the Negro question. And here is what Pogany said.
The Workers' Communist Party of America, in its fight against imperialism, must recognize clearly the tremendous revolutionary possibilities of the liberation movement of the Negro people. The Black Belt of the South, with its starving and pauperized Negro farmers and Negro agricultural working masses, with its Jim Crowism, its semi-feudal status, and its political system still bearing the earmarks of the period of slavery, constitutes virtually a colony within the body of the United States of America. The Workers' Communist Party of America puts forward correctly as its central slogan, abolition of the whole system of race discrimination, full racial, social, and political equality for the Negro people. But it is necessary to supplement the struggle for the full racial, social, and political equality of the Negroes with a struggle for their right of national self-determination. Self-determination means the right to establish their own state, to erect their own government if they choose to do so. The Negro Communists should emphasize in their propaganda the establishment of a Negro Soviet Republic.
But it would be a major mistake to believe that there can be any other revolution in imperialist America than a proletarian revolution. Now let me repeat that last sentence, because it's the key to this entire presentation. It would be a major mistake to believe that there can be any other revolution in imperialist America than a proletarian revolution. Well, moving forward to the year 1935, we come to this communist booklet entitled The Negroes in a Soviet America, written by James Ford and James Allen. Beginning on page 24, the general strategy is laid out in rather graphic form. You see, there's a major heading here entitled The Negro and Revolution. Directly beneath this, there's a subheading entitled Two Revolutions in One. And then within this section, it says, the problem of Negro liberation has two aspects. We shall first consider each separately and then show how the solution for the first flows into the solution for the second. Now, the next subheading then is entitled The Rebellion of an Oppressed Nation, And the section that follows that describes the violent revolution that must be fought to liberate the Black Belt of the South. And then finally, over in the next page, there's another subheading entitled The Proletarian Revolution. And here we begin to get an idea finally of what this phase of the revolution is all about. It says, capitalism is decaying. It is an outworn system. Capitalism is based upon the private ownership of machines, factories, railroads, land, and all other means of production. Only one thing can do away with the basis for the existence of capitalism: the expropriation of the capitalists. And by the way, I'm sure you realize that everyone here, by communist definition at least, is a capitalist. So you should feel good to know that there are those who are planning your expropriation someday. In order to expropriate the capitalists, the workers first need to discard the existing government machinery and to institute a working class government. Under this new workers' government, the building of socialism begins. Now, exactly what that's all about, the building of socialism, we'll get to in a moment. But finally, on page 28, under the third subheading entitled The Combination of Two Revolutions, the communists reveal how the two phases of their revolution are related to each other and which of the two is most important to them. Between the proletarian revolution and the revolution of the Negro people, there is a living link. This is the working class. Here reposes the leadership of the two aspects of the revolution. But the Negro communist is first and foremost the exponent of the proletarian revolution. Well, 1935 is a long time ago. And sometimes we hear it said that the communists have since abandoned this concept. But ladies and gentlemen, they cannot abandon it, for the simple reason that if they did so, they'd be abandoning the classic dual form of revolution dictated by Marxism-Leninism. They'd cease to be communists. To justify violence, they have to be able to claim that they're liberating people. And if people are to be liberated, then it's necessary to go through the motions, at least, of pretending that they have a right to form a nation of their own. And so the communist position on the Negro question today is no different than it was back in 1928. Now, Political Affairs is the official monthly magazine of the Communist Party in this country. The date on this particular issue is November 1968. The feature article for that month was The Right of Black America to Create a Nation, written by communist theoretician Claude Lightfoot. Now, Lightfoot points out that many years of migration of Negroes into the North and of Caucasians into the South have altered the population statistics to the point where the Black Belt is considerably smaller today than it was when the communist position on the Negro question was first drafted. Therefore, he says, the concept of a Negro nation must not necessarily be restricted to just one large territory in the South, but must be expanded now to include the so-called ghetto areas in the North. So having updated the basic strategy to reflect present realities, he then repeats the same old communist line. On page 9, he says, we should call for a plebiscite of all black Americans on whether they want to remain in the general Commonwealth or to establish another nation within the continental United States. Thus, the slogan of self-determination today means the struggle for the right of black America to form a nation if it elects to do so. Now, in passing, ladies and gentlemen, you may have wondered why the Communist Party has been a staunch supporter of the drive to place a black studies curriculum into our high schools and colleges. Well, the reason becomes obvious the minute you take a look at the textbooks and the study guides. The net effect of these courses on the students who enroll is to create a consciousness of nation. By stressing the historical and cultural differences between our black and white citizens instead of the similarities, the predictable impact upon the student is such that he'll view the communist call for a separate nation with far more acceptance than his parents did. Under the guise of academic balance, these courses have become a brilliant device for conditioning young people to accept still one more part of the total program for revolution. From this it follows that the advocates of a black nation must identify themselves with all that is required to set up a socialist America, recognizing that black people alone could never destroy capitalism. To digress again for just a moment, I'd like to point out that this concept of two kinds of revolution is really the basis for that much publicized split between Moscow and Peking. The Moscow group says there are two kinds of revolution, violent and nonviolent. We believe in using either or both, depending on which combination proves to be the most effective. But as true Marxist-Leninists, we believe that the gradual, nonviolent approach is more effective in today's modern world. To which the Peking group shouts in reply, heresy, heresy. True, there are two kinds of revolution, and we too are willing to practice either or both, but we are the true Marxist-Leninists, for we believe that the quick, violent approach is more effective in today's modern world. And there's the total difference between the two factions of world communism. Each claims to be more correct in its interpretation of classical communist strategy. But as far as the United States is concerned, you can be sure that it makes precious little difference. Both types of revolution are being used against us today. Both are enhanced by the presence of the other, and both lead to exactly the same destination. All right, let's move along now to the second conclusion. The strategy for violent revolution in America calls for chaos, anarchy, destruction, a crisis in government, mass confusion and panic among the people, and then out of the vacuum, the sudden seizure of power by communist-led guerrilla bands. Now, this is the kind of activity, the overthrow of government by force and violence, that most people think of when they speak about communist revolutions, so there's no need to belabor the point. But I'm going to take just a moment to show the extent to which the communists actually are planning to use this kind of revolution against the United States. Now, this is not so well known. Now, here is a book that I think ought to be in every home library. It's entitled Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson. Now, as you can see from his photograph, Manning Johnson was a Negro, and he was also a member of the Communist Party. He joined the party as a young man because he honestly believed that the communists were trying to improve the conditions of his people. He was a dedicated communist. And eventually he rose to one of the highest ranks. He was appointed to the National Negro Commission of the Communist Party, USA. But after many years, Manning Johnson finally came to the realization that the communists weren't the least bit interested in improving the conditions of the Negro people. He discovered that instead they were merely planning to use his people, and these are his words, to use them as cannon fodder in a bloody revolution to destroy America. And when he woke up to this, he dropped out of the party and devoted the rest of his life trying to alert his fellow citizens of all races to the true nature of the Communist Party as he knew it to be from the inside. And this book contains much of that story. I wish I had the time to examine the entire volume with you page by page, but here at least is one short quotation that pertains to the immediate topic. Manning Johnson said, "Black rebellion was what Moscow wanted. Bloody racial conflict would split America. During the confusion, demoralization and panic would set in. Then finally the Reds say," now at this point he quotes verbatim from a communist directive that he studied while inside the party. "Workers stop work. Many of them seize arms by attacking arsenals. Street fights become frequent. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, the workers organize revolutionary committees to be in command of the uprising. Armed workers seize the principal government offices, invade the residences of the president and his cabinet members, arrest them, declare the old regime abolished, establish their own power." Now, here is a piece of vicious communist propaganda that perhaps some of you have seen. It's called The Crusader. It's published periodically in Red China and is widely circulated through the Negro communities here in America. It's written by Robert F. Williams, one of the organizers of the Revolutionary Action Movement, better known as RAM. Williams also was the president of the local chapter of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. At that time, needless to say, he wasn't telling very many people that he was also a member of the Communist Party. Now, one day back in 1961, he decided to start a small war of national liberation of his own. Apparently, he was too impatient to wait for the big signal. So finally, to avoid prosecution for assault with a deadly weapon and for kidnapping, he fled to Cuba and then to Red China, where he now writes communist propaganda. One other thing you should know about Robert Williams is that recently he was elected by members of SNCC, CORE, RAM, the NAACP, and similar groups as the president in exile of something called the Republic of New Africa. Following the communist line in every detail, these men claim that they're the representatives of a new government and a new nation within the continental borders of the United States. They issued a demand to the State Department that a large segment of land be turned over to them as their rightful territory. The proclamation said that they're now prepared to negotiate in good faith the peaceful transfer to them of the southern portion of the United States. The implication being, of course, that if they don't get it peacefully, then they'll just have to take it by force and violence. Already, the Republic of New Africa has established a central headquarters in Mississippi, and its leaders in the north are actively recruiting a Black Panther guerrilla force and what they call a Revolutionary Freedom Corps, the RFC, from among black militant students to act as organizers and to set up local provisional governments, as they call them, in the so-called ghetto areas. But the reason I've mentioned all this is merely to introduce properly one Robert F. Williams, the president in exile of this Republic of New Africa and the author of The Crusader. Now here is what Robert Williams says. The lifeblood of U.S. capitalism is its productive capacity and its extensive commerce. If these two factors were to become paralyzed and rendered sterile, the orderly function of the government establishment would degenerate into a state of chaos, and the superstructure of the system would collapse. The more automated a society is, the more vulnerable it is to forces of calamity. What would highly mechanized America be without electrical power? What would it be without modern transportation? What would it be without its industrial capacity? And then, having asked these questions, Robert Williams proceeds to explain in minute detail exactly how to manufacture the devices that can be used by a mere handful of people to ensure that highly automated America will lose its electrical power, its modern transportation, and its industrial capacity. I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that less than a dozen people, if they know what they're doing, can reduce any of our major cities into a helpless, seething mass of confusion, panic, and death. Just one person can poison the city's entire water supply, or destroy the main aqueduct, or blow up the principal pumping stations. And where would people in Los Angeles, for instance, get a drink of water if it didn't come out of a pipe? And how long can a human being survive without water? 4 or 5 days, perhaps? But long before that, there'd be tens of thousands of people dead in our cities, not from thirst, but because they were unable to defend what water they had from roving bands of desperate people who were dying of thirst. And that's thinking only of the loss of water. In your mind's eye, compound that with no food, no electricity, no way to dispose of sewage, no police protection, no water pressure to fight fires, no radio or TV, no telephone, no buses, no gasoline for your car, no way to escape, no place to go if you could. And don't think for a minute that the countryside would be immune from disaster either. In this issue of The Crusader, the communists call not only for extensive chaos within the cities, but for putting to the torch every village, every forest, every field, and every barn. The plan is for raging fires from one city to the next. The reason? Well, first, there's the value of sheer destruction. Secondly, it would force us to deploy our defenses and rescue units over the widest possible area. The communists point out that as long as our police and National Guard remain concentrated, they're invincible. But if they can be forced to spread out over the entire city and into the countryside as well, then they can be picked off from ambush one by one. And the third value of massive fire to the communists is psychological. The average American, they say, soft and decadent, when he sees billows of black smoke rising from one horizon to the other, when at night the only light he has to see by is the flickering red from flames leaping into the sky, he'll become paralyzed with fear and panic. He'll run away and hide and do nothing to interfere with the guerrilla bands as they strike at the community's power centers. The Crusader explains how to set up sniper units in crowded metropolitan areas, how to manufacture jumbo Molotov cocktails, the gallon jug size, and how to mix the gasoline with certain ingredients to make it burn like napalm, how to pour gasoline into utility manholes in the streets to set fire to the main telephone cables, how to put sulfur tips from matches into air conditioning units and blow up large buildings, how to ignite gas mains and oil storage tanks. It explains how radio-controlled model airplanes can be used to fly explosive charges over heavily guarded fences into gasoline storage areas or munition stockpiles. It even calls for infiltration into the National Guard units, revolutionaries posing as non-militants for the purpose of getting free military training and for gaining access to critical military supplies and heavy weapons. And then, finally, Robert Williams says this: any all-out minority revolution must create a state of crisis wherein almost all of the male population would be forced to remain in their homes to protect their property and families. The middle class is very large, but it is not accustomed to deprivation and terror. Because of its affluence, it has waxed soft. It has no stomach for massive fire, blood, and violence. The motive force behind its life drive is its endless pursuit of prestige, conspicuous consumption, and sensual pleasure. A few years of violent, sporadic, and highly destructive uprisings will set the stage for the grand finale. After the stage is properly set through protracted struggle, America could be brought to her knees in 90 days of highly organized, fierce fighting, sabotage, and massive firestorm. Now, ladies and gentlemen, no evaluation would be complete if we failed to note that the communist blueprint calls also for white retaliation and violence in the black communities. It's a very important objective for the Communist Party. So far, they've only been able to involve a small percentage of our Negro people in this war of national liberation. The great majority want no part of it in any form. But the one sure way to change that is to have white vigilante groups striking into the Negro sections supposedly to seek revenge. We mustn't kid ourselves into thinking that the communists have placed their agitators only into the black communities. They're working both sides of the street. They want hatred, violence, and bloodshed between the races, and they don't care how they get it or whom they use, even children if necessary. Part of the plan calls for commando squads of black revolutionaries to drive into the white residential areas and shoot little children playing on the sidewalks for the sole purpose of drawing out of the white communities violent retaliation into the black communities. Now, this is extremely important to the communists. They must have it, for in this way they plan to unite the entire Negro population for protection behind the militant minority. It's not a very pretty picture, but it's one we need to understand, so that no matter what happens to us or to our families, God willing, we'll have the strength at least to avoid doing anything that would play further into the hands of the communists. Ladies and gentlemen, the plans and preparations for a communist revolution of force and violence are far advanced. The organization behind these preparations has almost unlimited financial resources, and it provides both training and leadership based upon years of experience in many other countries. Our enemies are deadly serious about their task, and it's nothing short of national suicide for us to continue to ignore their plans and their progress.
At the National Convention of the American Communist Party, held in New York City in June of 1940, James Ford, the Communist Party candidate for the Vice Presidency of the United States, said,
"For the Negro in the South, my people, the Negro people of America, have in the Communist Party their best defender, the unfailing champion of their cause. I accept this nomination for Vice President of the United States.
By this time, the communist champions of the Negro race had hidden the revolutionary ideas and slogans behind the humanitarian banners of jobs, security, civil rights, and peace.
I am Leonard Patterson. When I was a young man, only 23 years old, I joined the Communist Party. I was a member of the National Executive Committee of the American Young Communist League. In 1930, I was the official communist candidate for election to New York State Assembly. I knew Gus Hall and other top-ranking American communists very well because I trained with them at the Lenin University in Moscow. I joined the party because I honestly thought the communists were trying to help American Negroes. I broke away from the party when it became clear to me what the communists were really up to was to use the Negro people in this country as cannon fodder in a violent and bloody revolution aimed at the establishment of the American Soviet dictatorship. It was that simple, and it is still that simple today. Make no mistake about it. What is happening in the United States right now under the banner of civil rights is exactly what has happened in China, in Cuba, in Algeria, and many other places around the world.
I'm Julia Brown. For 9 years, I was a member of the Communist Party, serving as an undercover agent for the FBI. During that time, I learned that the communist conspiracy had been planning and working for years to bring violent revolution to America. It was to be a communist revolution, but the great majority of the American people would not be allowed to realize that until it had already happened. If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights. Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people. Their strategy simply has been to keep hammering on that wedge, to drive it deeper into our social structure, to open all wounds that have long since healed, and deliberately to create new ones wherever they can.
White revolutionaries have joined in some of Black Power's revolutionary goals most vital to international communism, such as support to the communist Viet Cong in the war against American forces in Vietnam, and particularly in organizing so-called student power forces to take over American colleges and universities. Jerry Rubin, one of the white revolutionaries working on behalf of victory for the communist Viet Cong, reveals plans for coordinating the forces of radical white youth with those of Black Power.
The goal is a massive white revolutionary youth movement, which, working in parallel cooperation with rebellions in the black communities, could seriously disrupt this country. The United States will find itself faced with rebellions from 15 different directions.
What is communism? I've been on the inside of communism. I still have contacts. From this knowledge, I tell you as simply and seriously as I know how. Communism is a lying, dirty, shrewd, godless, murderous, determined, as J. Edgar Hoover says, a criminal conspiracy. I'm choosing these words deliberately. As I travel around, I still have people say,
Why are you so hard on communists? They're just another political party like any other, and a poor minority at that, and so misunderstood. Well, we don't want them misunderstood. In years to come, if democracy falls, historians are going to look back on this time in which we are now living, and they're going to say, how could any free and intelligent people living in a country like America let a gang of vicious outsiders come in and take over? Well, of course, the only answer would be that most Americans didn't realize or couldn't believe until it was too late that communists are what they are. People wonder, how can a communist look you in the eye and tell one barefaced lie after another with a straight face, the way Gromyko did with President Kennedy on Cuba? Well, the explanation is simple. Lying doesn't mean the same thing to a real communist that it means to you and me.
A stunning display of dishonesty from the national press and radical left politicians. That is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. Last week, about 680 undocumented aliens were arrested by ICE officials countrywide. Many of them have already been deported. The coordinated raids targeted aliens who had committed crimes in the USA, mostly felonies. 75% of those taken into custody had convictions, including homicide and rape. One man arrested in Chicago and is an Iraqi citizen with a conviction of sexual abuse of a victim unable to consent. Many of the arrested non-felons were associating with the criminals. But those facts have largely gone unreported by the American press and by the radical left, which is actively misleading you.
What took place yesterday with raids in personal homes is part of the cog of the Trump deportation machine.
How inhumane this is to be breaking down people's doors and separating parents from their children.
This is Donald Trump really executing his campaign plan. He's trying to be a tough guy, so he's going to go after, the maids, the moms, the people that are working in the shops, instead of going after the hardcore criminals.
Maids, moms, and shopkeepers, according to that dishonest politician. Now, the false news reporting actually reached the level of hysteria. Newspaper headlines screaming things like, "The Trump deportation regime has begun. Immigrant community on high alert, fearing Trump's deportation force." On Devon Avenue in Chicago, news of immigration raids intensifies fears. We could find no headline in major newspapers, none, that bannered the fact the raids were targeted at illegal aliens who had committed serious crimes. Committed them. That's not press bias. That's blatant dishonesty. Here's another example. In the year 2013, the Obama administration removed from this country more than 434,000 illegal aliens, the highest number in history, which goes back to 1892. Did you see any anti-Obama demonstrations? Did you see any screaming headlines in the national media? No, you did not. Even after President Obama said this.
What we should be doing is setting up a smart, legal immigration system that doesn't separate families, but does focus on making sure that people who are dangerous, people who are, gangbangers or, or criminals, that we're deporting them as quickly as possible.
And that's exactly what President Trump is doing, exactly. But the illegal immigration issue has been set up by the media to demonize Mr. Trump as a racist and a brutalizer of the poor. That's what's really going on here, a setup. It's flat out disgraceful.
There's abuse in these facilities. There's abuse. This was them on their best behavior, and they put them in a room with no running water, and these women were being told by CBP officers to drink out of the toilet.
We just left the El Paso Border Patrol station, and now we're going to the Clint Border Patrol station. But what we saw was appalling and disgusting. We talked to a group of women, detainees, who said that they didn't have running water, that one was an epileptic and she couldn't get her medication. They were separated from their children. They've been there over 50 days. One woman said that the Border Patrol agent told her to if she wanted water, just to drink from a toilet.
We remain very concerned
about the conditions in which people are being kept. In fact, at the Border Patrol Station number 1, we had a chance to visit with about 15 or 20 mothers, some of whom had been at that Border Patrol Station for over 50 days. Some had been separated from their kids. When we went into the cell, it was clear that the water was not running. There was a toilet, but there was no running water for people to drink. In fact, one of the women said that she was told by an agent to drink water out of the toilet. These are the conditions that have been created by the Trump administration. These are the inhumane conditions that folks are facing. And so this is not just about more money for Border Patrol or for the Department of Homeland Security. This is also about the standards of care by which people are being taken care of, both children and adults. And we remain committed in Congress to making sure that these conditions improve, that this system be morally defensible.
Did you see somebody actually do that?
It's sad to see. She's getting bolder with her lies on this. And this is what's actually happening. And this is what the American people need to understand. People like AOC are operating off of a false premise, and it's deliberately designed to misinform the American people for her own political ends, right? Remember, first there was no crisis at all, okay? Then it was a manufactured crisis. Then it was a crisis completely created by Trump. Then there were concentration camps. Then people are Nazis. Now she's saying that Border Patrol agents harassed her and forced migrants to drink out of toilets. This is insanity. This is not true. There's no one else corroborating these kind of reports, and yet she's using it to try and make her case that we shouldn't have any enforcement and that we should have open borders. This is really dishonest behavior from a member of Congress.
Here was Ocasio-Cortez just last week in a public hearing explaining that actually global climate change is the fault of a specific racial group. Watch.
Do we see largely that it's the global South and communities of color that may be bearing the brunt of the initial havoc from climate change?
Without a doubt, without a doubt.
And in terms of that wealth, the people who are producing climate change, the folks that are responsible for the largest amount of emissions, or communities or corporations, they tend to be predominantly white, correct?
Yes, and every study backs that up.
The people that are producing climate change, end quote. That's right. Those people, the ones destroying the earth, driving entire species to extinction, killing children. Ever notice how all those people look alike? They've got something in common, don't they? That's right. They're the same color. That's what she's saying. Standards have changed so much that it's hard to say something genuinely shocking in this country anymore. But that qualifies. For all the hysteria you hear about how the president is a racist, Donald Trump has never said anything close to that. Nothing close to as bigoted and vicious as that. The people wrecking the world are all of one race? Who talks like that? In fact, it's hard to think of anyone in American life saying anything that disgusting and foolish and dangerous. If so, exactly what would it be? And yet, and here's the amazing part, nobody seemed to even notice when Ocasio-Cortez said that in the middle of a congressional hearing. Rulers acted like it was all totally normal, because increasingly for them, it is normal. This is an ominous development for this country. Talk like this will destroy us. It has come close before, as you know. It's possible that Ocasio-Cortez doesn't really know what she's saying. You'd like to think that she doesn't. Maybe she's just young and lacking wisdom and can't hear herself. The problem is that others can hear her clearly. Every time she encourages her followers to hate and distrust other people based on their race, some of them will. And over time, this is how countries fall apart. So going forward, here's a plea to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Keep saying what you think is true. Keep taking jabs at the establishment in Washington. Even those of us who disagree with you will cheer you on. But my gosh, please, for the sake of the country and the children you don't yet have, please stop attacking people for the color of their skin. They can't change who they are, and neither can you. We all have to live here together anyway, and we won't be able to if you keep this up.
If the federal government cannot remove aliens who commit serious crimes in this country, then we don't have an effective federal government. Yet the far left and the press, knowing full well that the ICE raids last week were directed at dangerous people, chose not to report that, instead smearing President Trump. We have now reached a low point in American journalism. As for the far left, they are people who do not want any immigration enforcement. They want open borders, they want alien criminals protected, they want anarchy. Why? Because they don't like America as it stands now. So it is very important for all honest citizens to know you are not getting accurate information and that there is a radical element in this country that wants to destroy it. If this continues, there will be a breaking point.